Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. My name is Sviatoslav. I am CEO and founder of a startup called Open Minds, where we are working in the new emerging domain of cybersecurity, which is called. It has some overlaps with cyber, of course, and interestingly, different doctrines of different countries, whether sometimes put that into cyber or put that into hybrid warfare. But of course, there are many overlaps, many things that are similar in approaches to cybersecurity. So maybe for some of you, it will be something new that I'm going to present. But basically, my thesis is very straightforward. I think we are entering the new stage of European security in relation to the adversary countries like Russia and China. And this specific stage is not driven by economic warfare as we had before, or like during the Cold War we had all kinds of soft power, diplomatic warfare. It's not even driven by cyber just solely, right? But it's driven by also vast amounts of disinformation, of influence operations, of all sorts of propaganda, and quite often it's followed together with cyber attacks. I'll just give you one example. I'm myself a Ukrainian, and if you remember, Russia actually did a few very big cybersecurity attacks into Ukrainian critical infrastructure over the last 2-3 years. So one of that was when they actually shut down the biggest mobile and phone cell operator in Ukraine, Kyivstar. I think it was last year. But it wasn't just an attack itself, but also a big influence operation that was followed by this cyber attack. So when we are thinking of hybrid war, we should be thinking about how influence operations could augment any sort of cyber attack or economic attack, let's say. Yeah. So suddenly, this small, kind of relatively small cyber attack can have a huge influence because it causes a lot of panic. It creates a lot of uncertainty, and basically, these are the things we are trying to deal with. And today I'd like to share a few learnings from Ukraine and how we managed to just deal with this new domain of cognitive defense, and what is specifically could be done to actually operate in this new domain of security. So our team did in the last 2 years close to 60 investigations on audiences in hard-to-reach areas, basically trying to understand what drives the support of war when Russia tries to, for example, mobilize more soldiers, conscript more people. And we also, beyond research, we were trying to help our government clients, mostly it's like NATO countries, Ukraine, Ministry of Defense and others, in conducting counter-influence operations, like specifically how would they spot these tactics and procedures of spreading disinformation, spreading hostile narratives, and how would they try to counter that in any way? Yeah, these are some reports we publish, and it's available publicly. For example, recently we did a big one just before the German elections on how Russia actually tries to influence German elections through Telegram and other platforms. And there are a few more investigations available on our website. I have this number here, which is $12 billion. And I'll let you think for a moment what that could stand for. But that's basically a budget that China and Russia collectively commit to all sorts of cognitive warfare, to run their troll farms, run their network of fake media, and it's a huge budget. It's still hard to say for sure that, like the estimate is basically made within a few assumptions, but Russia's stake here is close to $2 billion a year, and China's is $10 billion, so together it's $12 billion. And unfortunately, when it comes to European defense, based on my just very simple evaluation of some of European Union tenders and programs in the domain of countering disinformation and cognitive defense, we are somewhere near $50 million. The modest estimate is maybe even less than $20 million of funding to counter this, which is a big problem, yeah, because you have 1,000-fold difference, and then you have another layer of problem where the advantage of the first mover, if someone tries to conduct an influence operation, is much, much bigger than an advantage of the first mover when it comes to kinetic warfare. Like, we know from history that in majority of the cases, the side that defends itself has actually more chances statistically to win in the fight. And, you know, basically just, if you even take the data from major European conflicts in the last 800 years, that was always the case. But in the new domain of warfare, in the cognitive domain, where cyber is a part of it as well, you have the very opposite scenario. Basically, to conduct an influence operation is something that is very cost efficient, very easy, very scalable, very agile, and very hard to trace. And to defend from it is basically, you know, trying to boil the ocean in some sense. So that's the domain where we have disproportionately bigger amount of investments of our adversaries, and Russia specifically in relation to Europe, and trying to influence our elections, our, you know, democratic process, our trust in institutions, of course. It's disproportionately bigger, and it's disproportionately more advantageous in terms of their strategies and tools and methods they use compared to what we are here doing in Europe. So honestly, I'm seeing Ukraine was first to suffer from major disinformation attacks and propaganda since its independence up till 2022, and still continuing doing so. And I hope there are a few lessons we learned that we could share, where we try to somehow operate in this space with very limited resources, as you can imagine. So I'm putting, you've heard this word disinformation, which is already a very heavy loaded term, but not all propaganda is just disinformation. So propaganda could use other various techniques. It could actually even, you know, claim very, very accurate facts. Actually, the famous person who ran the whole Nazi propaganda campaigns, Goebbels, he famously said that our strategy is to represent reality as accurately as possible. So it's not just about disinformation, yeah, it's about specific direct influence with a specific goal that could hijack, for example, our cognitive biases, just aspects of our cognition, psychology, social fabric, and other things. And then I put propaganda into even bigger domain of cognitive warfare. It's basically just one of the tools. So propaganda could be one, economic pressure, like also cyber attacks and other things could contribute to cognitive warfare, where basically as the final metric of optimization of our adversaries, like Russia, which we know from their doctrine, basically, yeah, and Gerasimov's famous doctrine on the hybrid warfare, where cognitive warfare actually aims to weaken adversaries. It's very Sun Tzu-like approach, right? So weaken the adversaries before they even start any sort of kinetic attack, so they already have much, much, much more advantage before that. And trying to change the slides. Okay, if
we have probably a cyber attack.
That's fine, we can continue without that. So the big question was, how do you go just beyond spotting disinformation, misinformation, fake news? So there was a period of time, probably since 2014 till till basically 2022, when the whole Europe was obsessed with fact-checking, right? You remember that. We had a lot of funding going through that. We had many institutions, think tanks, media organizations, private companies even offering services for fact-checking. But that's typically when we think about, thank you. When we think about propaganda and disinformation, when we think of someone who is trying to attack, we are thinking about FIMI. Have you heard about FIMI? Maybe could you raise your hands if you've heard about what is FIMI? Not that many people. So it's foreign interference, manipulation and inference. And CAB is coordinated inauthentic behavior. So think of troll farms, coordinated and inauthentic. Yeah, these are two important factors. Because if someone on Twitter presents misinformation, it's not necessarily an act of propaganda, right? It's like people could be wrong, people could have strong beliefs. But when it becomes a problem for us, it's when it's coordinated. So it's done on scale and purposefully. And if it's inauthentic, basically someone trying to impersonate someone, right? So typically we think about and like propaganda and disinformation within the terms of CAB and FIMI. And when we counter propaganda, then we have debunking, pre-bunking, fact-checking, all sorts of monitoring, media literacy campaigns. So that is like very conventional approach to countering disinformation, which was quite, I would say, resourceful and quite useful till the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. Because in 2022, things changed. First, it was the actually clear understanding that countries like Russia can go beyond just information operations, and they could actually start kinetic war, right? And we didn't quite get the signal from Georgia 2008 and Crimea, so everyone was still thinking, well, maybe things will normalize, and we try to appease them. But then we understand, okay, so hybrid warfare doctrine is a real thing, and they are really preparing the grounds, weakening, the Western alliances, weakening the trust in institutions, polarizing our societies, to actually, at the end of the day, do some sort of kinetic operation. So there was one more specific shift in 2022, 2023, and this one is related to technology, and I think you guessed what it was. It was the advent of generative AI, right? So it's not just the villainous and political kind of will and mandate of a country like Russia to conduct hybrid warfare, but it's also technological circumstances and environment that would allow them to do that very, very efficiently. So what we suggest and how I try to think about propaganda and counter-propaganda is not just within the realm of coordinated inauthentic behavior and FIMI, but also this is all, okay, I cannot change my slides again. So this is all supply side of propaganda, like basically thinking from the perspective of government actor who is trying to supply propaganda, but there is also demand side. And demand side is why people are willingly consuming propaganda, and they don't find any problem with that. And they have some inherent propensity to be seduced by a narrative. And if you followed events in the United States recently, you could see that even though you had a lot of evidence that some political leaders are having false claims about reality, misrepresent reality, get engaged in all sorts of mis and disinformation, and people are even aware of that, and even besides that, they are still willingly following the narrative. So when we are thinking about this demand or pull side of propaganda, it's the narrative order. It's something that helps us as human beings actually orient ourselves, and have this narrative that we could be part of, right? So throughout the human history, we had this big narrative, which was basically our religious worldview. Up till 19th century, we didn't have any problem answering the question, what is the meaning of my life, right? So like people were good Christians and or like any other religious communities, but let's take country like France or any European country as an example. And the things were pretty straightforward. And then we had basically into the 20th century the advent of pseudo-religious ideologies, right? Where they used the very similar mechanism, but they, instead of having the goal of, advancing the, being part of the sacred union with the transcendental God, they had very different goals. So we had three major big ideologies throughout 20th century. We had communism, we had fascism in the form of, and Nazism as a form of fascism as well. And we had the third one, which is, I call American dream or consumerism. That's probably the last, survived ideology, where the final goal is basically the American dream, the access to goods, and we are driven by that narrative as the Western societies. We're still there, but there is something special that came with post-structuralism and postmodernism criticism, that we started questioning these narratives, specifically the narrative of progress, the narrative of structure, of order, and the narrative of even American dream and as the broader concept. And here you have all the things like the end of history and other things, where it created a huge gap. It created a huge void where this narrative is not present anymore. And interestingly, propaganda could hijack now this gap and could insert their own narratives, because we don't have anything else which has this strong vertical orientation now, and that's basically the tactic Russian propaganda used. So my answer to the question, what should be counter-propaganda from the demand side, demand as like myself as an individual, what is my demand for, why there is a demand for propaganda and for narrative order, is actually the best answer is also the narrative, yeah? So it should be just a different narrative. And basically, I think that's the part that we lost as a Western civilization. So we don't have anymore one unified narrative that helps us orient, and potentially, even all sorts of polarization, they still don't create the one strong narrative. I think especially Western Europe is a victim of that. I could sense it as an Eastern European, that Eastern Europeans, in the last decade at least, they have much higher scores in different psychological measures of well-being. At least the scores are growing much more rapidly compared to Western Europeans. They also have much better understanding of the meaning, like basically there is a question of the meaning of life, like how meaningful they find their lives, how meaningful they find their engagement in communities. Interestingly, Eastern Europeans and Poles in particular, but also Czech Republic and other countries, they interestingly find their lives much more meaningful over the last 10 to 15 years, which potentially, I would hypothesize, they have this narrative of overcoming struggle and overcoming their post-Soviet identity and actually growing their countries into affluent and rich places. And it's not like that in places like the United Kingdom, where I reside now, for example, or some other places in Western Europe. So there is much bigger questioning of the narrative order, and Russian propaganda prevails on that. Basically, it deepens these questions, it deepens the doubt, it deepens the doubt of what's the idea of the West, what's the idea of Europe, yeah? What is the essential idea of the European Union as well? And I think that's why it's extremely powerful. So basically, as a small summary here, we readily consume propaganda and disinformation as we are actively searching for a narrative order in the world. And this order is something that helps us just operate in the environment where there is huge uncertainty and anxiety. So there is something safe we could like just be part of and feel this order, and there is sense of security. And in a nutshell, we don't have the powerful narrative orders we had in 19th century, coming from religious traditions. We don't have these powerful narrative orders that were pseudo-religious ideologies. And now we don't even have this narrative order of the idea of unified Europe, the idea of progress anymore as well. So that's where propaganda thrives, and that's where we should be thinking, what are the alternative narratives that should be presented or could be reinvented perhaps, or rediscovered to inoculate us from all sorts of disinformation and propaganda. Because it's not just trying to spot every single fact and fact check it and debunk it or pre-bunk it. If you imagine we have like a godlike tool that could go and spot all sorts of misinformation campaigns and troll farms and accounts on all social media platforms. Imagine that for a moment. And there are millions, if not tens of millions of these accounts. And imagine even somehow we manage to regulate platforms and they start banning all of these bot accounts. They start restricting their behavior. Imagine we have this, which is, extremely, extremely difficult to achieve. And the problem is that the next day you do it, these malign actors can just go and recreate all the infrastructure, they have all the technologies, they know all of the vulnerabilities, inherent vulnerabilities of our social media platforms, of our democratic open internet spaces, and they can just simply recreate these whole troll farms. And we've seen that many times. We are following many different groups of companies and like government institutions in Russia doing all sorts of influence operations, and we know how they operate. So it's basically, I would probably say, almost impossible to do anything about the offensive side, and it's very hard to protect ourselves with just debunking and pre-bunking news and checking them. But I think what we should do, we should start searching for the solution on the demand side, not on the supply side. Yeah, not just cutting supply chains. That's fine, and there are many people doing that, and there are many institutions doing that. But again, searching for the alternative narratives we ourselves should perhaps find and test and find a way to distribute as an inoculation. Yep. Lastly, okay, this is a chart that would actually represent why we are seeing more and more disinformation and influence operation attacks. I would claim that there are two big components. The first one is cost of content production. The second is cost of content or campaign dissemination. Yeah, cost of campaign dissemination. Think of pre-internet, Cold War era. If you have a book, if you have an idea, and you want to distribute it to Soviet Union from the Western Europe, or to like eastern part of Germany, or to Hungary or Poland, you have to somehow smuggle it. You have to print it somewhere. You have to distribute it, which was quite hard, right? It's a very time-consuming and energy-consuming effort. With the internet, with the social media advent, you now have it much easier. Yeah, you can distribute it, online. You don't have to pay for each and every copy of your content. But there was no major drop of cost of production till recently. And cost of production is basically how much effort and time and people you need to write this book, or to write this essay, or to write this publication, right? So even till 2022, Russian employed many hundreds of people in Olgino, close to St. Petersburg, who were from 9 to 5 typing all sorts of comments and pretending to be real people living in Europe. But something changed in the last 2-3 years with an advent of Gen AI. Now you don't have to employ these people. You just have a few AI agents walking around internet and acting as they are a 35-year-old citizen of Lille, Michelle, who works, in the art gallery and who has specific radical political views, for example. And they have many personas and agents for that, and the cost of dissemination now is all-time low, as well as cost of production. And cost of production is something that has decreased, I would argue, 100 to 1,000 times in just the last 2-3 years. So that's where the root of the problem to counter disinformation and influence operation is eventually. Yes. This is the last summarizing slide, basically. So with my speech, I try to just make a brief argument for why it's not sufficient to just fight with disinformation on the defensive side. So my proposal that Europe and NATO should be more assertive, should actually not be afraid of maybe testing some waters on the territory of adversaries or some proxy countries. Basically what Radio Free Europe did in 1950s and 60s, trying to communicate to people, trying to decrease the willingness to escalate conflict further to places like Russia or Belarus or other places. And I think that's the lost art of cognitive warfare and cognitive defense that we now, as the West, and France in particular, Germany, United Kingdom, are already doing some great efforts there. We should, I believe, and I would argue, recall the best practices that we did during the Cold War and start engaging more into more assertive side of cognitive defense and cognitive warfare. So not just do pre-bunking, debunking, fact-checking, but also try to understand the adversary audience, try to understand what we could communicate to them and what we could offer, what kind of narrative eventually, right, we could offer to them, so that would increase their willingness to escalate conflict and project this hatred towards other countries and the democracy itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can applaud you.
Hello. Thank you for this presentation. So I came in a bit late. As a disclaimer, maybe you've covered this, but I was wondering, as to your last point, on maybe we could suggest a counter-narrative that can have also influence. What do we do about the, how to say this, the monopoly of, these platforms that are using algorithms that don't necessarily always favor a certain type of narrative or favor others depending on engagement, right? So how to make sure that within the world we're living, in which narratives are essentially spread through social media or through platforms, how do we navigate this problem? I don't know if this is clear.
Thank you. Okay, that's something I'll try to give a very concise answer to. And I'm sorry I'll sound very pessimistic, but I think in the probably next 4 or 5 years, you will not see major turn of social media platforms being cooperative around things like spotting disinformation. And we just saw the recent pull out of Facebook, and other platforms from that effort. But the problem is not that they want disinformation to strive, it's just an externality created by the very, very essence of social media, which is algorithmic feed that drives engagement. And all sorts of disinformation narratives can thrive on that. And unfortunately, we didn't create the sufficient necessary blocking mechanisms how we can prevent it. So I think it's a trap that now we have to live with, and some countries like Finland or Sweden try to just double down on media literacy where they can. I don't think there is good solution so far again. So I would argue it's one of the biggest problems we are facing now in the 21st century. Disinformation and misinformation was one of the most widely discussed topic during the World Economic Forum and ranked as the second biggest threat to humanity. So that's why I'm partially in my presentation opening up the question rather than just giving a specific answer. As you see, I'm saying we might want to have a counter narrative, but we are very far away from even starting the first steps. And countries that are at war, like Ukraine, might be a good experimental ground for that. And there are some learnings from Ukraine, how they actually managed to create this societal resilience. Yeah, so still a big way to go. Thank you.